This is chapter 3 on federalism. So let's begin the lecture. The first question is, why is dual federalism considered a theory rather than how federalism works? Essentially, you have to distinguish between two concepts. One is dual federalism and the other is cooperative federalism. Here's a pictorial of the differences between cooperative federalism and dual federalism. So on your right here, where you have the cake with separate layers, is a concept of dual federalism. The national government, state government, and we haven't talked about local government. That should be in the picture too in the 21st century, because you have three essential independent units of government. Anyway, each is in the concept of dual federalism. Each unit of government, state and national and local, are all independent of each other and operating in separate spheres. That is, they don't overlap. They're working on different functions. They have different responsibilities. So, for example, the national government under dual federalism would be involved in foreign affairs. The states would be involved in things like roads and policing, and the local government would be involved in education. And if you look over on the left-hand side, the left piece of cake, which is a marble cake where the different kinds of cake, chocolate, vanilla, whatever cake it is, are all intermingled. And that's the idea of cooperative federalism, that the different units of government are all operating kind of together. That's a notion of the concept of cooperation, and they're all working on the same things. Okay, so if we look at dual federalism, the characteristics of it are as follows. Powers divided between the national government and the states. The local government didn't come along till much later. Each has a separate sphere of influence. The duties are assigned to each. Specific duties are assigned to each. The national government functions are limited, and there are essentially three things. One is foreign policy, any kind of national laws that need to be passed in the eyes of the founders that would include commerce, essentially business things like the need to have laws that enable businesses to practice in one state and in another. Like you couldn't have different money types of money or different ways of doing business. The rules and laws all had to be the same, essentially, so that a company could move around, or a business person. There wasn't companies much then. Business persons could move around and practice their trade or occupation, whatever you call it, um, without much difficulty, whether they were in any of the existing 13 original colonies. And the last thing the national government would do would be to settle disputes. These disputes we'll talk a little bit more about later, but essentially any kind of problems that would come up, the courts would be responsible, and essentially the national government would be solving problems between the national government and the states, or between states, which happens quite a bit. Even in this day and age, you've got states who sue each other, individuals who sue states, the national government fighting states. All of those things are brought into court. Um, to give you an example, is if you look at states fighting each other, the states along Lake Michigan, particularly um, the states of Illinois and Wisconsin, are constantly uh, battling each other in court over who's really polluting Lake Michigan. Um, State functions, according to dual federalism, are everything else. So then, essentially, you should know that that dual federalism divides power between the national government and the states. Local government wasn't in the picture at that time, um, and that the national government was limited to the three things I listed here, and states were then given the power over everything else, which would be, things like education and welfare and roads and um, anything and everything that governments do. Now, cooperative federalism is quite different. Here you have the idea, like that marble cake, where both the national government and the states are involved in the same issues. So if you look at the 21st century and you look at what's going on in federalism, state government and the national government both are highly involved in education. If you remember back to President Bush, that is W, before 9/11, he talked about how he wanted to be the education president. And he brought about or started No Child Left Behind, which was a national program that was essentially going to bring the states who were on the lower end of the scale in terms of their ability to have their kids pass standardized tests, to bring them up to higher standards like the states that were doing better on the tests. So there would be these national tests, and it would be of students, it would be of teachers, they would be all about trying to get everybody up to a higher standard. So you could see that the national government was involved. Uh, President Bush didn't have much to do with this after 9/11, but that was the whole idea. The second thing is cooperation to solve problems, that they would work together. And essentially, in their working together, you have the national government doing two things: setting the agenda, that is, deciding what issues they're going to cover, what are most important that the governments ought to be spending their time and money on, and then second, providing the national government providing the money. The states would carry it out and essentially be the administrators of carrying out the agenda, providing the administration of, like for example, with No Child Left Behind, setting up the tests and then administering the tests to students and teachers. And they would have some independence here. It wasn't like they were just bureaucrats who do what they're told. They have a considerable amount of independence in an effort to carry it out, because the national government can't really police it, and the states are allowed to put the program together, and only if they're egregiously violating the rules would the money be restricted or withdrawn. Here's an example of some of the basic kind of structural ways in which the governments are different. You have the national powers listed here on the left: maintain a military, declare war, etc. And then you have the shared powers: collecting taxes, establishing courts, and so on. And then state power: establishing local government, setting up schools, and the like. So, in other words, this is how cooperative federalism works: that there's some things that are shared, some things that are left to the national government, some things that are left to the states. Next question: do the advantages of federalism outweigh the disadvantages? Well, you have to really kind of look at what are the advantages and disadvantages. Here you see the advantages: the possibility of experimentation, accommodating regional preferences and diversity, the federal division of power, protecting liberty, policy flexibility, the incredible knowledge of increased knowledge of citizen preferences, and mechanisms for reducing conflict. So those are the advantages. Let me kind of explain each of these a little bit. Um, the possibility of experimentation: federalism is always touted as a form of government that you can try things. For example, it was only a state or two that decided they were going to go to daylight saving time. And so the idea being that somehow you could save energy, make better use of time, and so on, if people were able to operate in the light longer during essentially during the summertime when the day is longer. That was started out, and then eventually a whole bunch of other states do the same thing. Um, you could see this with all kinds of policies that are tried, especially efforts in the area of trying to collect taxes. One of the biggest problems that state and local governments have is that people don't pay their taxes. And so, what should you do about it? Should you try a tough policy? Should you try a carrot, or a stick, the tough policy or easy policy in order to try to get the money. Um, and so that kind of thing is always in the works. Some people give, like amnesties for a while, or just pay the tax. We won't charge you the fine. That would be the sort of carrot approach, or the other way around, throw people in jail if they don't pay their taxes. So you can try these kinds of things and see if they work. Um, it's always something that if it works, then everybody else will jump on board, and you can think of your own examples of how that might work. Accommodating regional preferences and diversity. Well, this is a very diversified country, and you've got essentially the South and the West and the Northeast with very different cultures, political cultures. And so you have to allow differences. Like for example, here we live in the West, and gun policies are very different here than they would be, say, in Chicago where we came from. So the politics and culture of Chicago and Illinois would be such that guns would be much more restricted, and here they're much less restricted, especially uh, the use of rifles, and not so much handguns, but rifles. And you'll see signs from time to time, no guns allowed. So that's just advocating for regional differences. Um, there are all kinds of things like that, and I'm sure you can think of your own. Federal division of power protects liberty. Um, the idea is that oftentimes states deny people their rights. A classic example would be the right of African Americans to vote was restricted, especially during the 50s and 60s, and it took a Civil Rights Act to change that. So the federal government had to do it. The federal government had to step in, or the national government. I use those terms interchangeably. They had to step in and make the changes because the states were, especially in the South, were discriminating. Um, Another thing, of course, is flexibility, policy flexibility. You can have all kinds of different laws, and you do at the national level, state level, and local level. You have all kinds of different laws, sometimes contradictory, like I mentioned, the gun policy. Some places, like in Georgia, require people to have a gun, and other places have, like Chicago or any other big cities, have restricted people's ability to get guns. Even though the Supreme Court changed that policy, um, the local governments have fought back in places like Chicago by making it very difficult to get a license for a gun. Um, Increasing citizen uh, preferences, or increasing knowledge of citizen preferences. What that means is that there's more of an ability, because you got these different levels of government, national, state, and local. There's a different abilities um, to know what the citizens want. And then the last thing is a mechanism for reducing conflict, because there's so much diversity, and you can allow for a lot more freedom in terms of whatever laws and ideas and customs that each state wants to adapt. You reduce the conflict. The disadvantages are what I've listed here: policy confusion. There's almost no such thing as a national policy, because every state is doing something different. So whenever you try to have a national policy, like for example, um, if you had, when you go back to something like the Supreme Court decides that there won't be any prayer in public schools, that took a place over a course of about 20, 25 years of court decisions, and finally deciding that in public schools there's not going to be any um, prayer. Well, there's a considerable amount of confusion about that, because there is still prayer going on. There's sporting events where they pray before the sporting events and all that kind of stuff. So, the idea that somehow, okay, the Supreme Court said this, and now this should be the national law of the land, um, is not the case. So, um, you get confusion about it. Is there anything like a national law? And for the most part, you have to say no. A lack of coordination, that goes without saying, that if you have all these different entities, like say if you think about the police departments, you've got the police departments at the national level, FBI and CIA and so on, and you've got state police, and then you've got local police. Uh, Trying to get cooperation of all of them is not easy. Um, Everyone has their pride and desire to be the one that dominates the cases or whatever. So if there's something going on that requires cooperation, most likely they don't get it. Um, this always happens when there's a major crisis. We come to the conclusion that there is a lack of coordination, even within an organization. Like you take a national organization like the FBI, FBI agents said at the local level that they warned the higher ups about terrorists that were involved in 9/11, and then when it happened, the national people argued that they never heard anything about this, and it's just a lack of cooperation, coordination. Um, there's a lot of bureaucracy. That's the third one. A lot of bureaucracy, redundancy. Um, you have all kinds of examples of it. Everybody has to have their own bureaucracy. And there's very little cooperation. We see some of it now where, like cities that have very high expenses and they don't have a lot of money, they'll use the same facilities, like a dispatcher for the police or for the fire department, something like that. They'll use the same facilities, but for the most part, everybody repeats everything else. A classic example of this, I would say, would be libraries. If you have a governmental entity, whether it's in this case of libraries, it would mostly be cities. Everybody has to have their own library. Even if you're a tiny little village, you've got a library. Maybe it's the size of a closet, but you've got a library. And how silly that is when you've got big cities with major holdings, and all they need to do is charge the smaller entities some fee and allow everybody to use these bigger facilities. We haven't gotten around to that. To some degree we have, but not much. And the end result is that it's just one bureaucracy on top of another. Um, Certainly, federalism is complex. It's very hard for people to know, for example, for citizens to know who to blame. Is it the national government that's to blame? Is it the state, or is it the local when something goes wrong? You just look at something like Katrina. When you had Katrina, you had a massive effort on the part of governments to run away from it. You had the national government trying to handle like relocation and temporary housing and all that through FEMA. And then you had the states who were complaining that they weren't given advance notice or anything from the national government about what they were doing. And the city of New Orleans, the mayor of New Orleans, was complaining as well. So in the public, since nothing was being done, and it was just it just went on forever. Um, I guess you could say they can blame them all, but that's not how people think. And for the most part, the blame went to FEMA and the blame went to President Bush. Number three, how does the national government dominate? Well, it does. It definitely dominates the system. It wasn't supposed to. If you look at the Constitution gave almost all the power to the states. Yet if you look at how it operates today, the national government is clearly the much more dominant partner. And there's three reasons for that. One is, first of all, the national government over time, especially since FDR and the New Deal, the national government got involved in all the functions that were once assigned just to the states. The idea of supporting education or roads or any kind of thing that the states were involved in the past, the national government started to become involved in it by giving money, mainly to get us out of the depression. That was the concept that FDR had. But it also got the national government involved in things that it wasn't signed in dual federalism, and it wasn't in the Constitution. But the states and local governments wanted to see that national government money coming to them. They still do today. And as a result, the national government all of a sudden became involved in everything that the states were doing. And as a result, presidents like President Bush could come out in our time and say, I want to be the education president. And nobody would say, wait a minute, that function doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the states. By this time, or by the time President Bush was president, that was no longer the case, and people could see that as a admirable or important function for a president to perform. So this long period from the 1930s to the present, where the national government decides that it wants to get involved in functions that were assigned to the states, mainly because they see a problem. You know, they see something like it doesn't look like it's going very well. Like education is always a problem. We look at the concept, you know, Johnny can't read, or Johnny living in Mississippi, or Johnny living in New Mexico, for that matter, isn't able to match up to the standards of some kid who's living in New York or Chicago. The whole concept there would be that somehow the national government has to get involved in that, so that we can bring Johnny up to snuff and make sure that he's able to get a job and live like everybody else, as opposed to at a high level in the United States. So the national government sees a problem and then wants to jump in and solve it. The second thing is that the national government has the money, and through grant and aids, that is through giving money to the states for a particular purpose, they've been able to get control. Money is always control, especially in a capitalist system, and that's one of the ways they did it. You can go back to, probably the best example of this would be to go back and look at the 1950s when President Eisenhower was president, and they decided to build a highway across the whole United States, the interstate highway system. That interstate highway system that exists today was built through these grant and aids, where the national government was giving a lot of money to the states to build the highways. And they still do that. They still do that kind of thing, and the states rely on it. And then once you get it, once you start to get money money for a whole series of things like education and highways and building infrastructure and all kinds of things, you rely on that money, and before you know it, you're dependent on it as much as somebody depends on their Social Security or welfare check. And the last one is the national government sets the agenda. So these are the three ways that the national government has become dominant. Jumping in and trying to solve problems that are originally assigned to state and local governments, having the money and willing to use that money with grant and aids, and then setting the agenda for the country, because the national government is really powerful in terms of its control over the media. It gets the media attention much more than any state or local government ever could, and gets people to think that it's important that certain problems be solved, whether that's something like the war on drugs or the war on crime or whatever it is that the president sees as a major domestic problem. So here's the fourth question: what does it mean that the Supreme Court is the umpire in the federal system? There's four things here. One is that it settles disputes between the national government and the states. You had problems like that from the very beginning of the country. You go back to right after the Revolution. States were complaining, especially militias. That is the fighting groups that came from each state. You know, like today that would constitute like the National Guard. these militias were promised all kinds of things by the national government to keep them in the war against the Brits. And then when the war was over, of course, the national government didn't have a lot of money, and they didn't want to pay off. So a number of states were ready to do battle to get their money or get their, whatever they were promised. And so the national government then, through the Supreme Court, became the people who could settle it peacefully rather than having them shooting at each other. So that started from the very beginning and continues because there's a lot of conflict or confusion, I should say, about what powers belong to what entities. You've got the national government, you got the state governments, you got the local governments, and it's not clear who has power over anything. And so a lot of times there's a feeling that the other governments are stepping on our toes or violating our jurisdictions, and oftentimes this leads to a conflict that winds up in the Supreme Court. Even with laws, laws are passed all the time. Like, for example, most recently would be the laws against gays, or if you define it more positively, like defining marriage as the union of a man and a woman. Those kind of laws were passed by states, and you got that kind of thing going on. And then the Supreme Court comes along and says no, and so you got the states then ask themselves, well, what power do we really have? Can they just do whatever they want? The national government, that is, can it do whatever it wants? And are we stuck? And one of the ways that they will fight this is by going to court, and then the Supreme Court has to decide. Another example of that would be Obamacare. A number of states have complained that they don't want to participate in it, and as a result, it winds up in court. So much does in the United States. This is a society that really is interested in adjudicating everything. Okay, so that's one thing, why it's the umpire. It settles disputes between the national government and the states. Individual cases of one state against another state. I mentioned about Illinois and Wisconsin, and pollution and going to court. Well, oftentimes those cases start in a state court, but it's more likely to finally be settled in a national court where you have two different states. And again, this is a very practical approach, because if the Supreme Court can settle the disputes, then you don't have a resort to violent means. Not that that would probably happen in the 21st century, but it certainly was the case at the beginning of the country. Cases involving individuals and states. Individuals can sue a state for a whole variety of reasons, particularly somebody who works for a state, or something happens in a state, like you get in an accident or something, you can complain that the highway department didn't do enough to salt the roads or whatever that caused your accident, things like that, or the settlement that they wanted to give you, the state wanted to give you when you had your accident, was not enough money, or you ran into a truck that was a state truck, and you want to sue the state because that truck shouldn't have been on the road, or was going too fast, or going too slow, or it could be anything. Anyway, those kinds of cases are solved by the Supreme Court. And then ultimately, the last one ultimately decides all cases it considers important U.S. constitutional issues. So anything it considers, the Supreme Court considers to be something they want to hear, that's a national problem, they can decide it. So all these reasons, settling disputes between the national government and state, individual states against other states, individuals or citizens against the state, or anything that the national government or the Supreme Court, I should say, wants to bring or get involved in, makes it an umpire in the federal system.